Well, I want to welcome each of you as we begin this morning our new series, our new study in the book of Joshua. And I know that we are all grateful for the rain and the cooler temperatures. We've had a long siege of hot weather and dry weather, and so we want to certainly be thankful for the rain. And I don't know where everyone is this morning, but our crowd is certainly smaller than what normally is. But that shouldn't bother us at all, because it makes no difference if there are 5 people or there are 100 people or 1,000 people. We do the same thing. We do it the same way. I've never, ever done a series in the life of Joshua. I've never really studied this material in any way before. But I'm becoming more and more excited about it. And this morning's only an introduction, and I want you to see Joshua being born during a time that's really dark in the history of the Israelite or the Hebrew people. The man Abraham was given a promise by God. In fact, there were several promises. But one of the promises was, I will give to your descendants a wonderful land in which to dwell. But Abraham has a son, Isaac, and Isaac too is blessed by God. And Isaac has a son, Jacob, and Jacob is really blessed by God. And as you're making your way through the story of Jacob, you find he has 12 sons. Everyone remember that story? And one of the younger sons, Joseph, is highly favored in the family, at least by his father. But he's also highly mistreated. Now, he may deserve that. I'm not sure all the dynamics of that. We could study that. But all I know for the purpose of this story is he is greatly mistreated. And what you're going to find is this phrase that Burke's about to put up over and over again in this lesson. Now, I'm not sure where that picture came from. That's Burke's origination. That's apparently an actor. And he apparently makes this statement toward the end of the movie. And the statement is, life is not fair. And Joseph could tell you life is not fair, because here he is, a young man, and he is clothed wonderfully. He is living in a luxurious world. And suddenly he, by the ugliness of his brothers, his older brothers, finds himself as a slave in Egypt. And it gets worse. He's a prisoner in Egypt. But then by the gracious, providential care of God, he is lifted out of prison. And as you well know the story, he is made to be a ruler over Egypt. And he's second only to Pharaoh, and he has all this power. And he brings all of his family, all this Hebrew clan, into Egypt. And for years, they are wonderfully blessed. And they again live in this wonderful luxury. And Joseph is the ruler, and they're multiplying in numbers. And Pharaoh dies, and Joseph dies, and there comes a new Pharaoh. And he looks at all these Hebrew people and he sees an opportunity. And the opportunity is that he will enslave them and he will make them be workers in his Egyptian cities. They'll make bricks, they'll build cities, and they'll live their life under the harshness of the Egyptian taskmaster, the one who holds the whip. Now, do you remember how long that lasts? It's almost impossible for me to comprehend this length of time. 100 years? No. 200, 300, 400, and maybe 430 years that they're living in this horrible, unfair situation. They've been made to be slaves, and it's in this period of time, toward the end of this period of time, that Joshua is born. We don't know how old he is as we begin the story. 17, 18, 19. Most people kind of think 18 or 19 years old. He's been making the bricks. And he's there when he sees this rugged-looking man from the wilderness arrive, whose name is Moses. And his life, at least in the beginning stage, is intertwined with Moses' life. And I've tried to think about his parents. He's called the son of none. And over 400 and something years of slavery and mistreatment and abuse and hard work, I suspect a lot of those Hebrew people forgot about God. And they probably forgot about the promise that God made to Abraham. But some of them didn't. Some of them didn't. Some of them kept talking about it. I suspect Joshua's parents kept talking about it. Because he sees this rugged man coming, and this man marches right up to Pharaoh, and he says, I want you to let the people go. That's what God says, let the people go. And Pharaoh is this domineering dictator. And he's full of pride. And pride hardens anyone's heart. And he says, I'm not going to let those people go. In essence, he says, I give the orders around here. And so you remember what happens next? And Joshua's watching all this. Remember what happens next? One by one, Moses, by the power of God, will put upon the Egyptians a series of plagues. Now, I don't know if you can read all those plagues or not. I do not have them memorized. The first plague and the last plague are really unusual. And then water turns to blood. The Nile River turns to blood. You can imagine the stench. And the people in that arid region are desperate for water, and they'll dig wells beside the Nile River and find water filtered through that sand, but it's a horrible plague. The last plague will be horrible too. But in between, look at the little tiny things that God uses in great proportion to make life miserable. A fly. I don't like flies. I don't like flies to get in my car. I don't like flies to get in our house. When one gets in our house, Susan and I take a fly swatter and we'll chase it around till we finally get it. But imagine flies in such a quantity, you can't even see the light of day. Imagine flies in such quantity, you try to walk into your house, you can't sleep, they're everywhere. And gnats. And anybody here like a gnat? I mean, they get around your face and you keep doing this and they can so easily get in your ear and you can swallow them. And that's just one or two. And maybe sometimes I get into a little swarm of them. But what if there are so many gnats that you can't even see the sun? And everywhere you turn, they're all over you, and in your house, everything's covered with gnats. And he takes those little things, like grasshoppers. I mean, you try to drive out in the country right now on a four-wheeler or a side-by-side like we have, and you go check the cattle, and all of a sudden, boom, one of these grasshoppers hits you in the head, and they're everywhere. But what if they're so thick that not a living green thing is left? And locusts? And finally, when the last plague comes, and Joshua's watching all this, the last plague, the firstborn, everything firstborn in Egypt, every single thing dies. And Pharaoh says, all right, the people can go. And Joshua walks out of Egypt with Moses and all these hundreds of thousands of people. And they go out of Egypt, and they're not gone for very long until they get a surprise ambush attack. There's war. There's war that comes upon them. The Amalekites come. And God will not take that kindly for the Amalekites to come and attack his people. In fact, you'll find that God will ultimately rid the earth of the Amalekites. But someone has to lead an army, an untrained army. Can you guess who's going to be the leader of that army? It's going to be Joshua. And Moses is the one who stands up on the hill, and Moses has learned if he'll take that staff and hold it up into the air, that Joshua and his men will win. But if his arms grow weary and his staff begins to lower, the battle goes the other direction. And so two men will come along beside Moses and hold his arms up in the air and give him strength. And suddenly Joshua is a military leader. And you go from there and you go to a mountain. It'll be called Mount Sinai. And Moses is called by God to go up on the side of that mountain, and he'll be there for 40 days. And during that 40 days, he'll have carved out some rocks, some stones. And on those will be printed by God himself 10 very specific commandments. But as he goes up on that mountain, he takes someone with him. This young 19 or 18 or 20-year-old man named Joshua will go up the mountain with Moses. And they go through all that experience. You remember a lot of that experience. And now they're still trying to get to one place. All the while, they're only going a short distance to try to get to the Jordan River, because across the Jordan River is going to be this land that God promised to Abraham's descendants. But on the journey, they come to a body of water we call the Red Sea. And at the Red Sea, they're trapped. They can't go forward, and the problem is they can go around, but they turn around and look, and here comes Pharaoh in the distance, and Pharaoh's coming with an army, and Pharaoh's very, very angry. So here they are at the sea, and you have Pharaoh coming, and they don't know what to do. But Moses touches the water with the staff, and this water separates. And there's this, I don't know what it's giant walls. That's what the old movie Ten Commandments shows. Remember those walls of water? And now at the bottom of that sea, where it should be mud, saturated ground, it's dry, and these hundreds of thousands of people walk across, and they turn around and look, and here comes Pharaoh, but those waters comes caving in on Pharaoh and his army, and they're destroyed, and Joshua's there to witness every bit of that. Now, why am I saying all this? Because all this is so important to where Joshua is in his life and what he's going to be called to do. Because now they get right there at the Jordan River. And as they get at the Jordan River, they can see. They can look across and they can see this land they've been waiting for all this time. But God says, I want you to do something. I want you to send some men over, 12 of them, and I want them to investigate the land. And as they investigate the land, I want them to come back and tell you what it's really like. And so they go over and they spend all those days looking over the land. And you remember how fertile the land is? I mean, I just can't imagine the fertility of that land, the lushness of that land. Do you remember the grape story? Everybody remember the grape story? They find one clump of grapes. Now, Suze brings home grapes from the grocery store, and they come in clumps. But they're about, the big ones that big. This is so large that they tie it to a pole, and they put it on a shoulder of a man, another shoulder of a man, and they carry it back over across the Jordan River as evidence of what this land is really like. And so the spies finally return. By the way, one of the spies is Joshua. And they return. And they say, look at the grapes. The land is every bit as good as we thought it might be. It's even better. It's a wonderful land. It's a great place to live, except it's really dangerous. In fact, I'm going to tell all of you people, if we go over there, they live in great big cities, and they have walls around their cities, and they're mean, and some of their people are like literally like giants, and we're like grasshoppers before them. And I'll tell you what happens. We go over there, We'll be in a land that flows with milk and honey, is what they call it in the Bible, but we will die. That's what 10 of the 12 spies say. But there are two, Joshua and Caleb, and they can hardly believe their ears. They can't believe what they're hearing. How can you act like this? How can you talk like this? Because God's going to deliver. Why would Joshua think God would deliver? Why would Joshua think that God would deliver? I mean, if he talked to his grandparents, he wouldn't be certain, would he? And if his great-grandparents had been alive and he talked to them, he wouldn't be certain, would he? But what has he seen, standing apparently really close to Moses? Plagues like nothing has ever happened on this earth before. And a sea parting. And taking a ragtag group of brickmakers out to fight a war. And the only reason we win the war is because Moses holds his staff up in the air. I mean, look at what he's seen. And a sea parting. Look, folks, stop and think about this, Joshua's saying, and Caleb is saying. If God did all that, I don't care if they're giants. I don't care what it's like over there. This is easy. God's going to take care of us. But all the people begin to panic. And they become so easily afraid. I wish sometime we could just stop and talk about what people are really like, what we are really like. We so easily become afraid. And we so easily become persuaded by other people. And we so easily become persuaded by other people who are negative and who tell us that the world is going to cave in and the sky is falling and we don't have a future. And we so easily get persuaded by those kind of people, and so persuaded we get into a panic. That's the way all people are. So remember what God does at this point? He essentially says this: faithless people don't get what I promised. That's why throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, there's one word that keeps coming to our ears, and that's the word faith. And that's why the New Testament will say, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because God has shown these people in a short span of time. This is not over a lot of years. This is a very short span of time. Egypt to the Jordan River, a short span of time. And he's shown them all these things right so clearly. And yet they won't believe. And they fall apart in fear. And God says, without faith, you don't get to enter in. Without faith, this is not going to work. So here's the deal. You're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 more years. To all of you faithless people, die. Now, Joshua and Caleb, you're an exception. You get to stay alive. But I want you to think about what the wilderness is like for 40 years. I haven't liked this weather this summer. I don't know how you liked it, but I haven't liked it. I've grown weary of being too hot. I've listened to other people, and they finally, after months of it, said, it's enough. I can't wait till fall. I can't wait till a day like this. What if it's 40 years of desert living? What if it's 40 years of desert dirt? What if it's 40 years of eating the same thing every single day? I mean, I hear people complain when they eat the same thing for 3 days in a row. And I'm thinking, wow, 40 years. That's a long time. I go from 19 years of age to 59 years of age wandering aimlessly, just going around in circles out in the desert. This is Joshua. This is what Joshua gets to do because of those people. So I'm going to tell you again this phrase. Life is not fair. Life is not fair. And it wasn't fair for Joshua. Everybody understand that? It was not fair for Joshua. And I think God pays attention to how we act when life is not fair. I think he paid attention to how Joseph acted in the beginning of the story when life was not fair. And by the way, you know how Joseph acted? He acted like he belonged to God. When he was a slave and when he was a prisoner, both. I think God pays attention in how we act when life is not fair. And for 40 years, by the way, how do you act when life is not fair? And I'm going to tell you something. Though our number is small this morning, Greg and Karen are in Arkansas seeing grandchildren, but even in our small number, I know there are people here who can say right now, at this given circumstance in life, life is not fair. How is it that something can strike one person as a really good person, we think in our mind, at least a really good person, and another person over here, not quite so good as we think, and they just live so easily and everything goes well, and where's the fairness in that? And to be stricken with a disease, life's not fair. To be stricken in a way where you can't walk on your own, life's not fair. How many stories do we have right here in this little assembly where you can say, I have been in a situation where life is just not fair. I've been handed something in life I didn't plan for, I didn't want, I didn't deserve, it just happened. That is everyone's story. That is everyone's story. Life is not fair. And how do you act when life's not fair? Well, shame on me, but I've had a tendency to whine. And I've had a tendency to say, if they just act right, I wouldn't be in this situation. And I've had a tendency to stomp and fuss and kick and be negative, and I don't think that works. I don't think that works. Joshua, though I don't know any stories really in that 40-year period, I think he lived the 40 years in the wilderness. Not his fault. He shouldn't be there. He should be in a land that flows with milk and honey. But these faithless people caused him to walk for 40 years in a desert. And I think God's paying attention how you and I act. And what he wants for us to do is to hold on to our relationship with him and trust him in those times. And when we do, I wonder what he has planned for us. And that's the last thing I want you to know. I don't think that I'm going to be a Joshua, and I don't think you're going to be maybe a Joshua in the sense that we read about him, all these stories we're about to read. But I wonder if he really has, if we live by faith, has something planned for you. I mean, Moses didn't understand it, but God had something big planned for him. Joshua didn't understand it, but God had something really big planned for him. Doesn't have to be really big, though. How do you know that God's not about to use you to touch one person, to change one situation in the life of a child, or to have an influence that he's been wanting someone to have on a particular situation? How do you know? All I know for sure is that if I don't live by faith when life is not fair, he can't use me at all. I might as well wander in the wilderness of this world for the rest of my limited days. But that's not what God's calling me to do. Not what he's calling you to do. So I want to pause there, and we're going to take our Lord's Supper. One of the problems with this kind of material in the Old Testament is you don't talk much about Jesus. And I kind of feel like all of our assemblies ought to be talking about Jesus because we're his kingdom. He's our king. And yet when I think about life not being fair, who was more mistreated and unjustly so than the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who stepped into our world to save us? And all the while knowing that there would come a time when people would mock him and call him names and mistreat him and finally crucify him. And we've said that word so many times it has no real effect on me sometimes, but it's the most cruel death that man has ever designed that I know of. Nothing like it. And he could have said, in the midst of all this, it's just not fair. I don't like it. It's not my fault. It's their fault. I quit. And he literally could have, as we sing, called 10,000 angels, and I'm going to tell you, they would have put a stop to everything. He could have done it. But he didn't. He stayed with it to the very end so that you and I could be in his kingdom. Cleansed every single day of our sins. Re-cleansed and re-cleansed and re-cleansed. Cleaned up every day by the blood of Jesus.